Hello everyone, my name is Josh and welcome to Whims. And today I'm going to give you a review for the 5th episode of Series 7 called Eulogy. And this episode was co-written by two people, Charlie Brooker, who's the main showrunner of Black Mirror, but there's also the playwright Ella Road, who did a couple of things for theatre. She's done a lot of stage plays, written a lot of stage plays, and she's done quite a few things for TV, but this is probably one of her most popular ones, or one of her most noteworthy ones for, a much more bigger audience. And this episode follows Paul Giamatti's character, who has the name Philip Hegarty, or McHegarty, and he basically is a sort of lonely, middle-aged man, and he gets a phone call from a funeral company called Eulogy, who says the family of one of your close acquaintances, one of your ex-girlfriends, Carol Hartman, has just passed away, and the family have reached out to you to provide materials for our funeral service so that we can have an immersive memorial service. And what he basically means by that is if you have any photographs or any sort of personal memories, personal memorabilia, we can actually, create a narrative around it. And we can actually give this person a full, we can paint a very full picture of this person's life or an interpretation of a life through this very immersive software. And he starts to have 3 photographs at first. And these photographs are where they met, what they did, what they were into, and it would also showcase a personal memory, like how they went to the docks one summer to just go on a seaside vacation because his family owned a property just down the road. But then she seems like she's someone who doesn't like hot dogs, so they say, oh, she went for the beer kind of thing. But then there's the one where he has another memory or another photograph, which is basically, him looking at her from down a hallway and he doesn't know who took the picture and all these other things. So there's all these great little memories that very slowly start to come together. But then he realises that as he's going through, a journey starts to be established where it's like he wants to know where everything is or if he kept everything. And with him and this guide by the name of Patsy Ferran, who does a wonderful job in this as well. Both Paul Giamatti and Patsy Ferran do a really good job of selling this very kind of immersive, almost kind of Ghosts of Christmas Past or Christmas Carol kind of thing, where you are basically having this character who's very reclusive and very much, in the sort of like the later stages of his life, the winter of his existence, sort of looking back over old memories and seeing how he can improve himself or redeem himself. It's almost like a modern day twist on a Christmas Carol almost, where it's like he's looking through his life, but except he's not redeeming himself, he's redeeming the relationship that he had with this special person in his life that he might have messed up on. And it's a really engaging episode. I loved the idea of when he puts on this little chip on his temple, he actually can go inside photographs and he can actually create these very, very realistic looking environments with just, this photograph. And he feels like he's in it. He feels like he's there in the moment, in the memory, experiencing it again, tasting the food or smelling the smoke from a barbecue, for instance, or smelling like the fresh paint off of a wall when they're painting a wall, and the landlord got pissed that they were basically doing up the wallpaper when they said they shouldn't have redecorated. That was their first apartment together, and I love that memory. Like he basically remembers it almost as if a child's remembering the taste of ice cream with his family kind of thing. It's that sort of thing that really feels like he's not just remembering it from a story or a very auditory perspective. He's remembering the sensations. He's remembering everything about it. It's almost like when an elderly person tells you about the story of how them and their grandparent first met. It's kind of like one of those stories where they really do kind of beef up certain details, but they're doing it almost as if they remember every detail of that day, the smell in the air, the touch of the grass, if they could touch the grass, the feeling of the grass beneath their feet or between their fingers when they're lying down for a picnic or whatever. It's that sort of lovely experience where you really do feel that immersion, and it's a really powerful episode, and I just thought it was really beautifully done. Paul Giamatti's performance in this is fantastic, and I just feel like with all the details that was being given, like the fact that, he was in America, and she was British, but she's played by an American actress for some reason. She has the opportunity to go and, play the cello at this grand, opera house to watch Phantom of the Opera. But then she goes off to this place to do this opera thing. But then he goes over there, and he goes there with the intent of proposing to her, but she doesn't want to, because she kind of knows, I think, with the way Philip is, she knows that if she says yes to him, a part of him will always be trapped. And yes, they do kind of hint that there is a bit of a misunderstanding that happens between the two of them when when she goes off to Britain. He's staying behind in America, and he hooks up with another girl whom he met at the party years ago, and there's a picture of him sticking a middle finger up to the camera as he's lying down in bed with his shirt off and with a cigarette in his hand. And it's like, well, who's taking the picture? You weren't completely alone, the guide said. It's that she says, oh, there's someone with you in the apartment. And he goes, who? And then he realises that, it was another woman. And I love that scene in particular, because the guide actually starts to talk to him like he's his partner. And I really do like the fact that he's going, this isn't what it looks like. And she goes, oh, what does it look like then, Philip? And all that stuff. And it's like, he goes, oh, don't talk to me like that. And they actually do start to talk like they're a couple. And I really do like that, where it does start to feel like, oh, is there going to be a twist that she's Carol kind of thing? That's what I was thinking about. Like, the way they spoke to each other, it felt like it was a real couple speaking, as opposed to just two people who were just sort of going over it. And it really is it does lead you the impression that, she probably said no to his proposal because of that instance of that misunderstanding with him, because she phoned the apartment, and the girl he met at the party picked up the phone and spoke to her instead. And part of people would be led to believe that it was probably that led to her saying no to the marriage. But part of me felt like Paul Giamatti's character was basically a man-child. He was a man-child in the way that most people would be, because of course this was in 1992, the time when phrases like man-child probably wouldn't have been invented yet. So it was kind of one of those things where he was more busy trying to find his feet, because she was the one who was having all the success. She was the cello player, she was the instrument maker, she was the one who was having all these dreams, all these aspirations. She wanted to go to Britain, she wanted to go out to the world and travel and be adventurous, whereas he was quite happy to stay in New York and be, in his apartment and chase his dreams, be artists, musicians, aspiring poets maybe. But she was like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to sit down and watch life happen. I want to go out there and chase it. But he didn't want to. He was too afraid, probably. He was too afraid to chase it. And she was like going, well, I'm doing this with or without you. And that was it. But part of me feels like there's other things that happen throughout the course of the story as well that could have led to her saying no to saying I do, like I want to marry you kind of thing. But part of me feels like there's a lot of things that happen. Yes, she also was pregnant, but I feel like part of her knew that Philip didn't want to have a child. And even then the guide says to him in the restaurant scene, like, would you have said yes? Would you have said yes if she told you she was pregnant? Would you have said yes to having a child? And he goes, I don't know, we probably would have talked about it. And I really do like that, because he does portray it like a guy who says he would do these things, but would he have actually done it in the moment? Would he have actually said yes to looking after a child, even if he knew that the child wasn't his? What would he have done? And I've known people like that. I've known people like that who say they want to do things, but then they kind of mean a different thing entirely. And that moment was very heartbreaking to realise, because part of me feels like you never would have found out because you never got the chance to do that. And I think that was really heartbreaking to watch. And I think Paul Giamatti sells the emotion of someone who would say something like that. But he's probably just doing it because he wants to sound like a decent person, when in reality he probably would have been shitting himself even if it wasn't his child. It's that kind of thing. So you really do get the opportunity to see these people as people. And even though you don't meet Carol, you know her through and through throughout the episode because of what Philip says about her and what she says, what she does. And then there's this big twist, which I don't know. I keep going back and forth and saying, whether or not it was actually, something that was needed, but I think in retrospect it was. There's actually a twist in the episode that the guide that's been leading, Philip through these memories, these photographs and these mementos is in fact her daughter Kelly. And she basically, it's kind of like a story that if you were to play this realistically, it would be like, a woman turning up at his door and saying, my mother died and you knew her and her name was Carol. And they'd sit down in his living room and they'd just talk. He'd probably have a bottle of whiskey or something. And he'd look very haggard and he'd basically be living all these memories. And he'd be having music and things like that and say, oh, well, music will trigger a stimuli which will create these memories or help you remember these things. And it's such a beautiful twist because it does make sense what is going on. The fact that, he is someone who probably is ashamed of a lot of things that happened when he was with Carol. But what's very interesting is you believe every minute of it. You find him so frustrated as well because part of me feels like if you had just talked to her, if you'd actually just had a conversation, or if both of you had just had a conversation, you would have known the answers. But even then, I don't even think they would, because people like Paul Giamatti don't want to tell you up front the real truth. You can tell me the truth until you're blue in the face, but in reality, they will not listen to you because they will only come out and tell you something that's really on their minds when they're actually ready. And there's so many other depictions of this in media that I can think of. One person that I can think of in a TV show that I can think of is Nate Fisher in 6 Feet Under. But I think Nate is another example where he does have the ability to love, but he just won't tell you unless the time is right or unless he's pinned against the wall. And another person who I can think of in a book series that I've been covering a lot on this channel is Cormoran Strike. He's the sort of person that if you were to pin him up against the wall and tell him, what would you have said if someone came to you and said they were pregnant? Would you have stood up and said you would help them, or would you be with them, or would you say, no, I wouldn't want to do this? And I like how confrontational that was, and I like how the dinner scene with the guide who turns out to be, Kelly, really did nail it to him and say, look, would you have done this? Would you have actually stayed with her? Would you have actually, because you never asked how she felt. You were so focused on you and how you felt in that moment, how you felt heartbroken and betrayed. But in reality, you never really thought about what she was going through, what was going through her head. And it's such a wonderful catharsis because that's the sort of conversation that you would have had. And it's a very intelligently written screenplay. And I think the fact that it's written by both Charlie Brooker and Ella Road, it really does give you this impression that it's a two-hander of a play. You could almost imagine Charlie Brooker and Ella Road kind of playing out both the roles of the guide and Paul Giamatti's character in this episode. And it's very beautifully done. And I think if Paul Giamatti doesn't win an Emmy for this episode, I honestly don't know what's going on with the Emmys, because this episode is awards worthy. This episode is so emotional, and when you see the reactions on his face and you see him sort of like reliving these very poignant but very heartbroken memories, there were a lot of moments where I had to just stop the episode because I was just so overwhelmed by the emotion that he was displaying and how rich and how powerful it was. I'm actually getting emotional just thinking about it. But it was one of those episodes where I thought, this gives me the impression that this episode really was starting to think about things and actually making you go into this world, the internal world of this character's past, and unlock some very painful memories. But then he realises there was a connection, and part of him realises that he probably would have stayed. But there's also that hint of just maybe. Would he have stayed or would he have remained? And I think that's the interesting thing. And it was beautiful. It was a really beautiful episode. Very beautifully written, beautifully acted. And the fact that it was written by Ella Road, co-written by Ella Road, who was a playwright, you really do get the impression that this was almost like a play in how it was executed, because there is only technically one location in the entire thing. It's his house. But he goes through these memories and he sort of goes, you could almost imagine it being enacted like a play. You'd almost imagine the scene transitions, like the curtains closing behind them, and then the props for the house sort of blend seamlessly with the props of the restaurant maybe, or the barbecue on the rooftop at, at the coop, as he calls it, like the coop, like the chicken coop. I really like that because that kind of gives you the idea that they're still sort of young chicks, like little chicklings, sort of going out and flying, but in reality they're still men as well, men and women, sort of try to find their lives, try to find their feet in the world, and they're students there in this place that we'll call the Coop. It's really actually kind of an interesting analogy, I suppose you could say. But it was a very powerful episode. I loved it, and it was a really good. It's a very interesting episode because it's an episode that I feel you could almost do a double feature with this, with any of the more emotionally driven relationship episodes. You could do a double feature of this and San Junipero. You could do a double feature of this and Common People, and it does work either way because I feel like a lot of these episodes, by and large, except for maybe Bête Noire, feel like they could be a double feature of something else. Like Common People could be a double feature for Eulogy. Bête Noire could be a double feature with something like White Bear. Hotel Reverie could be a double feature with something like, San Junipero. With Plaything, it could be Bandersnatch. There's so many episodes that you could see as a double feature. And in fact, the very next episode that I'm going to be talking about, USS Callister to Infinity, is basically a double feature with the episode USS Callister. So there's almost like this feeling of duality at play. And the fact that he's taking on more writers this season really goes to show that he's exploring different concepts from all these different points of view, or two very different points of view. And it's actually a very intelligently written season because he's actually trying something different. He's not changing the genre, he's changing the voices of the genre that he's already creating. And I think that's why this particular episode will be up there with some of the greats, I think. And that's my review for Eulogy. This was a very emotional episode. In fact, I got a little bit emotional at the end there, sort of describing, Philip's journey and what he went through in the story. And it did remind me a bit of the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And that particular film is a very moving film because it's about, what would you do if you had the opportunity to do it all again? And what would you do? What would you do differently? What would you change? And it's very powerful, and it really is well done. And I think this episode is very well done. It's a very beautiful episode, and I want to give a special congratulations to everybody involved. Paul Giamatti, Patsy Ferran, and, the cast, but also Charlie Brooker and Ella Road, because they did an absolutely incredible job with the screenplay, and it deserves all the awards under the sun. Just this episode alone deserves all the awards under the sun. But luckily, there's so many other good episodes that have come before, and to a certain degree after this as well, because USS Callister, while it wasn't to the same degree as emotional as this episode was, it definitely was a lot of fun. It was a great way to close out the season. But you'll have to find out about my thoughts on USS Callister when I get round to it, so stay tuned. But until then, this has been Josh with Whims. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more, please click and subscribe for more videos. Take care. Bye for now.